Welcome, everyone, to Authors Bantering here, the podcast where author Ian M. Rogers and I discuss writing issues, writing topics. Last week we discussed structural editing, so this week we're going to go over line editing. This I was looking forward to when we were discussing the topics coming up here. I was looking forward to this week more than the prior week just because I enjoy line editing much more. And I think I might have maybe a pretty rock solid bullet pointed list of what to do for line editing in terms of these general overall things. So line editing, for those that don't know, this is basically more sentence level corrections. So sentence level just changes to your story, not so much with like the structural stuff with like character, story, and all that stuff. Line editing is much more focused on prose. And so I think when it comes to line editing in general, if you find that you have prose that's not working, so you're going through it and you're finding sentences that just are not working, I tend to default back to these three bullet pointed things, which is asking myself, are the sentences actually saying what I want them to say? In other words, are they actually conveying the topic and the idea that I'm trying to say? If not, can I go simpler? Can I shorten my language? So can I make the language simpler? But more specifically, can I make the sentences shorter? Can I make them smaller? Can I make them not razzle dazzle as much? I think, at least for myself, I tend to be someone that loves the loves the run-on sentence. I love long sentences. I love flowing sentences. I've always said I want to be the next Faulkner, right? But if there are sentences that aren't working, that are not making sense, I find that the best way to do it is to go simple. And then once you get to the simpler sentences, they tend to say what they're supposed to say. And the last point is, when you go through line editing, what I think helps a ton is trying to write by implication. And what I mean by that is, I was actually going through a short story collection by Mavis Gallant last month, and when I was going through it, I came across a short story called One Morning in May. And so I'm going to read just the opening three sentences here to get exactly my point across line editing here. Here is the opening. I was only 5 when he went away, so I don't remember him much. He was killed later when I was 7. It was right before my birthday, so I couldn't have a party. That is exactly what I'm talking about. 3 simple sentences. But the implication part I was talking about is the ending, right? You know, he was killed right before their birthday, so they couldn't have a party. As though to say, me not getting a birthday and this person dying are of equal footing. Like, they're both equally tragic, right? It's not said outright, but by implication, the way you've written it, you sort of implied that something very deep about the character. And that's what I think when it comes to lining, what you should be trying to do is to do that. To write simple, short sentences that can imply and make a lot of inferences. If you want to have really strong prose, I think that's the way to go 90% of the time when you are running into sessions that are just stumping you, that are just so difficult that these sentences aren't working. You're frustrated, you're pulling your hair out. I think if you can stick to those 3 bullet points, you'll probably be able to get through a lot of those tougher parts of the story. But yeah, I've been talking really, way too much. So
no. This
yeah.
This is good actually. So as you were discussing those, I was thinking that I do basically the same thing, though I would use different words to describe it. Um, I really like the first bullet point you have. Is the sentence saying what you want it to say? You know, this goes back to the idea, we were talking about this last week, of looking at the sentence with fresh eyes. You know, of course, you as the writer know what you want it to say. You know, in the back of your head, you know, you've been working with it and so on. But it's a matter of turning off that voice and really looking at it fresh on the page and saying, okay, is this sentence conveying meaning clearly to
Bingo.
a stranger, to somebody who doesn't, you know, have that voice in your head?
Yeah.
Which again is an acquired skill. I really like your second bullet point about going simpler. The idea of, you know, sometimes when we're writing, when one, we're not clear what we want to say, or two, when we maybe have some very highfalutin, you know, fancy, you know, we're trying to sound like writers, for lack of a better word. Sometimes you can fall into that trap of writing prose that has a lot of words in it, has a lot of stuff in it, but isn't saying a whole lot.
Yeah.
You know, and often for me, and I think for a lot of writers also, you know, getting down to what is this sentence really saying and is it saying it clearly can be a matter of cutting out all of those extra things, or even
Exactly.
just things like, more complicated phrasing. For example, if you use a phrase like "for the purpose of," replace it with "because,"
Yeah.
that can often help the sentence. I mean, you have to go case by case, of course, but in general, you might look for places where you can trim and shorten.
Mm.
And then I really like what you said also about implications. The idea of, what are your sentences saying beyond the words? Are they
Yeah.
implying something? And it's the idea that the best writing has words and sentences in it that very narrowly and sharply make the reader feel a certain way, convey a certain kind of meaning, have certain kind of implications. And often the trick to doing that is eliminating unnecessary parts so that only the core is there, connecting things in a certain
Mm-hmm.
way, like the death and the birthday party example
Yeah.
that you quoted before. But then also looking at what's beyond the text, looking at what's beyond the sentences. Can you use the sentences to have a deeper layer there? Which again is going to go much easier if you're speaking clearly, you're
Mm.
speaking pointedly, and you have sentences on the page that are saying exactly what you want them to say.
Absolutely. And I'd be curious to find out what your process is, though, for as far as the editing, right? Because structural things, obviously, we kind of went over that last week. But for myself, I imagine our process is going to be pretty different, you and I, because I do line edits as I go. I talk all the time about how I try to get my first drafts to be really strong. So I'm constantly making these revisions as I go along. I'm looking at my paragraphs I write, deleting them. I will what I actually do for myself is I'll actually take paragraphs and I will break them up individual sentences. So I'll hit the return key every single time and I'll get like a block of, 5 sentences that were one paragraph. And I'll go through and I'll actually read them individually just see if they make sense on their own. So out of, not being connecting pieces between different thoughts and ideas, just on their own, are they strong sentences? And that's why if you follow the vlog here, you'll see me all the time hitting the enter button all the time here. You'll see like these lines of like these very short paragraphs. That's what I'm doing. I'm going through and I'm looking at each individual sentence by itself and making corrections and then going back and basically reforming the paragraph again. But for me, it's constantly going through it every single draft, just making lines every single draft, and often reading aloud, mumbling to myself. Again, if you watch the channel, you'll see me sometimes talking to myself here, see my lips mumbling. So I'm reading the words out loud. I'm reading the sentences aloud. When it's in your head and you're just typing it, you lose certain things. You lose the way it sounds to other people when they read it. It's a different thing. You think it's the same thing, but when someone else reads it versus the way you write it in your head, it's two separate things. It's even though you think you're writing, even though in your mind you're like, well, it's text, right? It's the same thing. It's not, and especially the way it comes across and the inflection and the pause and all that stuff. It's not going to be the same.
Yeah, it's really interesting for me to hear any other writer's process, but then specifically to hear yours because I do the exact opposite of that. When
Okay,
I am
good.
no, this is and I think it's useful for listeners to see different types of techniques so they
Mm-hmm.
can maybe gauge how different writers do it and maybe pick up things that would work for them.
Mm-hmm.
But when I write a rough draft very specifically, I am not paying attention to how the sentences sound at all because
Okay.
odds are they're going to get rewritten anyway, and the paragraph I'm working on might not be in the final draft. The chapter I'm working on might not be in the final draft. So I, as a writer, do not want to waste a lot of time, fine tuning sentences that might just get cut later.
Makes sense.
I think particularly when I was, younger, just starting out, and I was really worried about how my sentences were going to sound. And so that worry would lead me to endlessly tweak and refine and so on. And so, I'd spend 10 minutes on a sentence and then I'd go on to the next sentence. And then I'd realize that the first two sentences didn't really connect, so I'd have to go back and change the first one and then go
Yep.
back and write a third. And then maybe there's connection problems there and so
Mm.
on. And so I found myself, kind of caught in this endless loop that was preventing me from making progress in a draft or in a writing. I was getting way too bogged with details. And so for me, learning to be more productive in my drafting stage and just get the ideas from my head onto the paper was really letting go
Okay.
of the how do the sentences sound. So I'll do little to no revising in that rough draft stage. But when I pull out the second draft and I'm starting to think more about structural edits and changes as well. Just naturally, when I'm kind of reading through, that's when I'll do it, with my pen on the printed page because I like to revise by hand. I'll go through and I'll sort of work with structural and line edits at the same time. So if I'm thinking about developing a character, and having that description of the character, pop more, have more information in it, be more pointed. A natural part of that structural revision is also going to be fine tuning the sentences. So for me, there's a lot of overlap there between, what we're kind of dividing into structural editing and line editing.
Yeah.
For me, I do a lot of overlap there.
Okay. And so I think most writers might go with more of your style than what I do. So with that, do you find that you're typically making these structural edits by themselves towards the end? Then are you someone basically where it's like the last few drafts, it's all line edits, like it's all basically
sometimes it'll be more line editing as the draft goes on.
Okay.
I might come to, a draft 3 or draft 4 and realize, wait a minute, there needs to be a new character here, or, this chapter needs to be moved or something like that. But as a rough rule of thumb, the first draft is going to be, or the first draft to second draft is going to be 80% structural, 20% line editing. By a draft 4, it might be, 5% structural, 95% line editing. Somewhere in there, sort of a gradual move to polishing the sentences more and needing to make fewer structural changes because those structural changes are already in place.
Gotcha. Okay. And I think that I do think that's how most people tend to approach it, is that same sort of style there, where
I think so. I think so too. I think it's too hard for most writers to sort of draw this arbitrary line in the sand between a big picture structural edit that you're making with very rough prose because you're just going to fix it later, and then fine tuning a sentence that the fine tuning you're making might also lead to some bigger structural changes. And so in that way, they're very, very much connected. That being said, though, I think the super pros, like, again, people who really, really have a firm hold over this process, can separate structural and line edits in that way.
Gotcha.
I think a lot of them will do the polishing at the very end, and they'll work with very, very rough material, moving it around and fine tuning it in that way.
Gotcha. I think you're right.
I'm not that kind of writer.
Yeah, I gotcha. And I was talking more about was having like these very defined drafts so that you're doing. Like, because for me, I often say I don't have drafts. I'll say I have a second draft just colloquially because it makes sense for to explain it to people that are following along my process because I've logged the whole thing now. But for me, it's not. I don't really have a draft. Like I always say, I don't really have a set number of drafts. It's just one draft that's always in constant set of revision. Like I don't ever draw really any kind of distinction between my first draft, my second, my third, my fourth. I could have a story that I've looked at, 10 times or one that I've looked at 5 times. But for me, I don't really make any kind of distinctions there. It's always the same thing. I'm always looking for the same
that's really
thing.
interesting to me, actually. So with a short story, there's obviously, fewer words, fewer pages. Yep. But with a novel, do you find yourself jumping around and working on different chapters, revising, just kind of, however your whim strikes you, or do you have more of a process for where to revise at any given time?
Yeah, so the process I have is, it's interesting. It's basically start reading, and the moment you notice there's an issue, start working on that part. So it's kind of like working almost like front to, almost like just going forward, right? Like just start at the beginning and go until there's a mistake and keep going. But I will constantly have to redo that particular section, or I'll put it aside, keep reading, come back, and go another time. So it in some ways, you're still using kind of a draft mentality in a certain way, but at no point am I ever really drawing any kind of distinctions there. And I'm always doing the lines, always looking for structural things, always have myself, okay, did I foreshadow that enough? It's very, very jumbled. It's not very distinct at all in my mind. Like I don't have anything where I have any kind of real distinctions anymore, because for me, I'm always trying to get that. It takes away from the sense of perfection when I do that, which is in some ways might be enlightening people, but for me it's dangerous, because if I tell myself, oh, this is a second draft, this is a first draft, I can be a bit lazy with my writing here, right? If I'm not reviewing it in my prose then, I feel like I'm slipping. I feel like I'm being lazy almost in a way
Mm-hmm.
that I'm allowing this bad writing to kind of seep through, this bad prose to seep through. So I'm constantly having to make changes even at the start, just to keep at least the story tight. Um,
That makes a
yeah.
lot of sense, actually. Just, wanting to challenge yourself
Mm-hmm.
in that way. And I think, like, if a writer is worried about their prose or worried about bad prose seeping in,
Mm-hmm.
a really good way to curb that habit, I think, is to do exactly what you're doing, is to, look at every sentence and really try and build it up.
Yeah.
Whereas before they may have been, not that you do this, of course, but another writer may have been in the trap of letting the bad writing sit,
Bingo.
instead of working with it. I think our processes aren't that different, actually,
No.
because again, I use a very similar kind of, start and then read until there's a mistake, which with a draft 2 or 3 is usually, no more than a few words, and really go until I hit the end, and
Exactly.
so, start revising chapter 1 and finish revising at chapter 25, or whatever it
Yep.
is. And then over the course of however long that takes, whether it's, a few days or a few months, when it comes time to go back to chapter 1, it's been however many days or months since I've looked at chapter
Yeah.
1. Therefore, I'm able to look at it with even fresher eyes
True.
because of all the revisions I've just done. And again, this goes for the structure level, but it also goes for the line level as well. Um, One thing I find a lot is that if I've got a sentence and I'm trying to make it the perfect sentence, I'll get to what I think is the perfect sentence, and then I'll step away from it and I'll come back the next day or the next week or the next month, and I'll realize, wait a minute, this should be tweaked here and this should be expanded, and I don't need these 3 words, and so on. So for me, the act of stepping away and coming back, again, I keep repeating this phrase, fresh eyes, but it really, really does help boost the sentences. And again, I find I'm able to make better progress and work more efficiently as a writer by doing a lot of revisions and then using time to my advantage by working on other parts of the novel. Adds up more
Yep.
time. The more time I spend, the fresher my eyes can be when I go back to those first sections.
Gotcha. And I think that definitely can work for some people. I would just set it aside and never come back to it.
No.
That's
That's
such
why I
that's my
really
style.
do think if a
Yeah.
person has that temptation,
Yeah.
they owe it to themselves to develop that discipline and force
Yeah.
themselves to focus. So
Absolutely.
I really, really like your way of approach. Again, everybody works differently. Everybody has different
Yes.
weaknesses as a writer. And I think learning what works for you and what compensates for your own weaknesses can help us all be just better writers, but also better at the process of writing.
Exactly. And I think the other thing too, exactly right, is figuring out where your weaknesses are though and kind of playing around that. Like my style right here, the reason why it probably would not work for most people is simply because you'll get so bogged down in the weeds. You'll tinker with sentences for like a month on like one section here, right? Like just you will find endless ways to procrastinate. So
Yeah.
you have to realize if you're the kind of person that's prone to doing something like that, then to avoid, then your style might work better. So it's a lot of it is just figuring out where your weaknesses are when you're writing and being self-aware enough to know if I edit as I go, right? That dreaded thing that people tell you not to do, right? Am I going to spend forever tinkering, or can I be the person that I can edit as I go, get it to where it looks a lot better, but probably not perfect, and then keep going on, then come back to it and keep making these changes. And for me, that's what it is. It's all editing as I go. Nothing you see is ever stuff that just came right out of my head. It's always been anything. Even my first drafts have been edited at least somewhat on the page as I've gone along.
And if we're talking about weaknesses, actually, I've been thinking about what my biggest weakness is as you've been
Mine's
talking.
repeated words. So
Or
yeah,
specific stuff like that. Of course,
yeah,
we all have our ticks and so on. But I think for me, as process wise, is again, because I do really, really focus on just getting these words down for a rough draft. I can't show my rough drafts to people, or
mm-hmm.
if I do, it's often not very helpful because it's difficult for people to look past the rough prose or the too long paragraphs or the sentence or the paragraph I just threw up there just to move on to the next one.
Bingo.
Beta readers or writing group members will often look at those and see, what the hell are you doing here? Like, what is this? What, and so I often struggle just with that part of the process. For me, it's been more helpful to, keep those rough drafts hidden and not show things to beta readers or critique groups until I'm a little little bit further along, just
Gotcha.
because those rough drafts are so rough.
Yeah, and I think some people definitely tend to vary a lot with that. It comes down to just what your style is, but yeah, I mean, and it you can. I will say, you can revise and revise as much as you want in a first draft. You are still never going to be as happy with it, even as you go along, unless you're the kind of person that's simply a one drafter. You're like Ray Bradbury or there's a couple other I can think of that where it's just like one draft, and by the time I type the end, it's over. Like I've had this whole so many times in my head. Pretty rare. I think it's a pretty rare skill, and it's not something that I've ever seen. But yeah.
I think it is too. I read that again, the old sci-fi writers of yore, the Ray Bradburys and the Philip K. Dicks and sort of the more pulpy writers, because they were writing for money and they were writing on these tight deadlines and they just had to produce words. So they, just by nature of this, pressure that they were under, they forced themselves to learn how to write that way.
Yeah.
Develop this, first draft, final draft mentality. Deadlines on Saturday, got to pay the rent this month.
Yeah.
Roll up your sleeves and freaking get it done.
Yeah, L. Ron Hubbard did something like that. Yeah.
L. Ron Hubbard, yes. First draft, final draft, yes. Yeah. And so, so this idea that, I think that's one way to do it. And maybe, if we were under similar constraints as writers, maybe we would be more forced to do it that way.
Yeah.
But I think both you and I have developed kind of a different mode of attack.
Yes.
For lack of a better word. Because we haven't had to deal with that, deadline on Friday, rent
no starvation.
On, Saturday. The starvation.
Yeah.
We've looked at solving different challenges. And so, again, I think that listeners would also be wise to think about, okay, what are your own challenges and what can I develop in my own process to not only write better sentences, but also revise better sentences and ultimately be better writers.
Absolutely. And I think the culture has changed. We see where we do have more time to do our drafts, and we are, I think, a little bit less pressure now. So that style definitely lends itself. But biggest thing is I think really is if you took nothing else away, I do think just trying to go simpler with, if you were just in a section you're stuck on, simple sentences, just simpler sentences, and aiming for clarity over this nice flowery prose, I think will get you a lot farther than spending months and months and months trying to get this thing just to sound so perfect. But that's what's always worked for me. And so with that, we'll start wrapping this up here. As always, we do this every Monday. If you found this to be enjoyable and helpful, please like, share, and subscribe, and always leave a comment. Always looking to take suggestions from the audience. And with that, we will be back next week to go over another topic. But until then, this is Josh Bresslin, that's Ian Rogers, and we will see you next week.
Take it easy.